I'm not going to give anyone any advice so that later people write to me, thanks for your advice. Now I'm out in the cold and have no job. A specialist shouldn't limit themselves to just their main job. They should work on pet projects.
If you're making an indie game, it's basically just a business project.
The product designer is half a product manager, and they need to be able to think about business the way a product manager does.
I didn't spend 10 years studying just to turn something on now and have it generate things for me.
You just have to accept that the world is changing. Look one step ahead and think, where can I fit into this new world and how can I work there? You have all these different A games and so on, but Game of the Year goes to an indie developer.
Hi everyone, my name is Sasha Ustinov. Today we have a new episode of the Design Podcast. I'm the founder of the design agency Beavers. I also organize design conferences in Belgrade and Novi Sad. Today we have a wonderful guest, Sergey. How do you pronounce your last name correctly?
Ternovykh or
Ternovykh, because in different places you have it written.
Somewhere it's just Terna.
Yes. Sergey Ternovykh, currently the design director at Nexters, but you have a very interesting story, a biography, and I think now is a good time to talk about it. Tell us a little about yourself.
Yes, my name is Sergey. I am currently working in the field of video game development at Nexters, which is located in Cyprus. I work there as a design director. I'm basically responsible for everything, not just visuals, but also narrative, sound, and even UX research. But originally, I'm not from the game development industry. I started out at Yandex, where I left as the design director for search. And after that, I had another 3-year period when I worked at a startup. I joined when I was very young and worked there as a CPO. Overall, I think we'll touch on this topic today as well, but it was also quite a successful period in my life. That's it. Now I live and work in Cyprus. So you have a guest visiting you.
Thank you very much. By the way, how do you like Belgrade? Have you been to Belgrade before, or is this your first time?
I was here once when I was flying through on my way to Barcelona. There were no direct flights from Cyprus to Barcelona, so I had to come through here. And we specifically decided to stay here for 3 days. It has a very pleasant, interesting vibe. It's a great city. As I think many people have noticed, it kind of has the vibe of Moscow in 2010. It's very green here, especially compared to Cyprus. Right now in Cyprus, it's summer. It's basically like the Sahara there. It's really pleasant here. The people are great. So, I mean, for the first time, last time I met Serbs for the first time and was surprised by their hospitality. It's cool.
Awesome, thank you. You gave a talk at the design festival that took place yesterday. And you talked about your unusual experience, about how you worked in big tech, then in startups. Now you're actually at a big game development company. Then in your lecture, you compared all of that, your whole experience. I think it will be interesting to talk about that today as well. Briefly tell us at the beginning, yes, the key differences between these 3 stages of yours, right? What is the main key difference overall, especially from a design perspective?
The industry or my own state?
Well, the industry is clear, yes, but how did you feel? How did you experience yourself in these 3 different areas? How did you feel as a designer or as a design director or as a CPO? But as a CPO, as I understand it, you were still largely involved with design, right?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about it because it seems like I always feel pretty energetic and equally good. But now that I think about it a bit, every time I make a big change in industry, whether it's big tech, a startup, or game development, it turns out that in a way, I kind of refresh myself each time and start absorbing a lot of new knowledge at a fast pace, knowledge I didn't have before. And that's a really dopamine-rich thing because, for example, after working at Yandex for 6 years, I already understood all the processes and how everything was set up. I could keep growing, and it was really cool. I love reminiscing about that experience. But at that point, I switched and started working at a startup where, in fact, the processes were completely different. And the same thing happened in game development. Again, everything changed fundamentally. There are some fundamental things that are common across IT everywhere, but at the same time, each industry has its own significant peculiarities. For example, as I mentioned yesterday as well, if corporations and product companies mainly solve their users' pain points, then in game development, you work with emotions and dopamine. You give people emotions precisely, not solve their pain points. And this knowledge about how to work with these emotions and by what methods, that's exactly what I was able and lucky enough to start absorbing right away when I joined Nexters.
And what was different in the startup besides the fact that there was less order and so on? You probably had more responsibility on your shoulders, right?
Well, look, there were a lot of things. Yeah, first of all, for me, the new thing was that I became the CPO. Essentially, I was ultimately responsible for design. But I had a talented design lead, Slava Barinov, who you saw our website, which,
Yes, let's just tell people what this startup is. Ah,
yes, after working for 6 years at Yandex, I moved to Cyprus and joined a startup. At that time, it didn't even have a name yet. There was only a technical prototype, but now it's called Lovey. The website is Lovey Care. And probably many people in the design community know it as the site that Framer featured on their homepage. I think it was featured for almost half a year. We were right on the first or second row of their landing page. We received a lot of recognition, including awards and Framer's Site of the Month. We got all sorts of awards, but as for the awards, I don't really remember. Maybe an HM, what is it called? Honorable mention, something like that. Not a very big award. We also got a couple more, well, actually a lot of mentions, got great coverage, and overall we were building an AI and design oriented product there, and it actually turned out pretty cool. So when I moved there, I took on the role of CPO, and it was, well, a huge number of differences compared to big tech. For example, I was responsible for the entire product, even when it didn't exist yet. So basically, you're facing a fog of war. You don't know if your idea will take off or not, whether there's product fit or product market fit. And you have to research all of this and figure out which direction to go. Therefore, in a startup, you're actually expected to pivot a lot because you go one way and hit a dead end, turn around, try a detour, and hit another dead end. And you keep going like that until you find product market fit. At the same time, one of the challenges was that there weren't really any competitors. And I'm a skincare person, so at that time, skincare was still a pretty new topic. It was hard for us to benchmark against others, so in many ways, we were pioneers everywhere. And that's also really tough because in a corporation, you usually don't create products completely from scratch that have no benchmarks. And probably a very important part is that in a corporation, if your project doesn't work out, you just move on to another project within the company, rotate, and so on. But in a startup, if things don't take off, you're out in the cold.
you might have to go to the job market and look for a new job.
Yeah, yeah.
Listen, actually, it's really interesting. Your biography, your path, it's kind of contradicts what's being said now, including by career consultants. It's like designers are now being divided according to business needs, so to speak. For example, you're an interface designer or a product designer, or maybe you specialize in fonts or something else. From a business perspective, that makes a lot of sense because you need someone who's focused on a specific area, but your approach is multidisciplinary, and you also have a strong business focus when you went into startups, and now you're diving deep into emotions, dopamine, and things like that. Why do you take such bold steps so confidently? Would you recommend that others act as boldly as you do? Or is it just that you're a uniquely daring person willing to take risks and try something like this as an experiment?
Well, I'm not going to give anyone any advice. I don't want to, so that later people write to me saying, thanks for the advice. Now I'm out in the cold with no job. But as for why, well, that's just the kind of person I am. First of all, every time I started a new job, I would say, give me challenges. In other words, the project itself isn't actually that important. What really matters is the team you're working with and how big the challenge is. Because I like doing things that others, well, often can't manage to do. And the fact that it's really difficult and that honestly, I hadn't even tried it before. So it turned out that when I moved to a startup, I had that challenge. Like I wasn't in that field at all. I'd never worked in it, not in startups, because our main market was the US, while at Yandex, the main market was Russia. And these are completely different worlds, different approaches. And when I was getting into game development and received offers, I also asked what challenge they were setting for me because I enjoy solving them. And honestly, it's all just for fun, for enjoyment. I just know from my own experience that I can well, in all of IT, I generally understand that I can figure things out no matter what the domain is. And the more domains I cover, the more expertise I accumulate in the end. And honestly, I just have no fear of moving from one domain to another. Because, well, right now, I think overall, I finished my career at Yandex quite successfully. I went through a startup quite successfully as well. Well, like if I don't get something now, okay, I'll just go to another organization. I won't be left out in the cold on the market for long, or I'll just start my own startup. So that's why I didn't really have that kind of fear because, well, I mean, I'm not exactly starving. And you know, I always think I'm all for working for pleasure, but if you're working just for the money, then you can't really perform at your best. So that's another reason why
Challenge.
challenge work.
Challenge, pleasure, cool. So look, maybe you could tell us more about that. Like, could you go into more detail? It seems like you have the most polar opposite experiences, big tech and gender. Could you briefly, or maybe in more detail, talk about these global differences? What's required in one? What's required in the other? Can someone move from one field to the other? What should we be paying attention to?
Yeah. And if we also consider, say, game development a couple of years ago, as people have told me about what the game dev market was like back then, the difference was really significant. Game development largely grew out of small studios where everything operated much like a startup scene. Yeah. Many were self taught, just people who were passionate about games, and that's exactly how they grew. In big tech, people often have specialized education, for example, in product management or product design. They have a lot of theory, a lot of practice, and a lot of product processes in place, how to properly research users, how to solve things using Double Diamond, all the frameworks, and so on. In game dev, there was less of this. And if we talk about whether it's possible to switch between the two, I also mentioned in my lecture yesterday that I think it's necessary because in both of these domains, people have competencies that surprisingly those from the opposite domain often lack. And I think it's not necessarily just for designers because it's hard for me to single out only designers all the time, but for product managers, designers, who work in game development and know how to work with things like level ups, new content, emotions, how to constantly engage users, bring them back so they don't get bored, to keep retention high, not just solve problems, how to bring this mindset to product companies. Product companies don't know how to do this yet.
They don't know how. They don't, right? Well, I think it's because, as I said earlier, product companies are focused on solving pain points. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, most of the time. I'm not talking about every project, probably. Some video streaming services, for example, solve fewer pain points. They're more about engagement. And there, people probably interact with this a bit better. At the same time, people from product teams can move, like I did, into game development and bring with them expertise in product methodologies and processes. Because here in various teams, especially now, I think only in large studios and maybe some medium ones, I can't speak for everyone, are there any established product processes? Right now, I'm working on making sure that we're really performing well, moving towards a more product-oriented approach so that our teams are organized properly, work more efficiently, and so that we do less of building new features that don't work the way we intended, because otherwise there would be a lot of negative feedback. How can you make sure, for example, that your production is much higher quality so that when you've already developed something on the client side, it will definitely resonate with users? And here, on the one hand, you can bring in processes and an understanding of really good product design, an understanding of UX. And from game development, it's actually about working with UI and emotions. And what else I've noticed is that, in my opinion, for designers from game development, a promising direction is various types of motion design and VFX design. Because, as you know, regular products and applications usually have very few bold, large-scale animations or movements. Everything is very much about micro interactions. Yes, covers are more or less the same. And maybe this is exactly the area where people can apply themselves, because there's clearly a certain shortage of this in products.
Now everyone is saying that the basic scenario tasks seem to be solved. So now let's Think about how to give more emotion, how to stand out in the market from a competitor's app that's just as convenient. And here, I think, is exactly where the opportunity lies.
To stand out?
Yeah, to stand out, to do something else. Right? In the gaming industry, everything is really about engagement. In other words, they have to engage you.
Yeah, if someone doesn't like a game, the competition on the market is so fierce that they'll just watch a series or get hooked on reels instead, because I think that for any product, whether it's games or something else, one of their main competitors is still Instagram or TikTok. Everyone is fighting for users' attention. So of course you need to stand out here, but first you need to learn how to solve their pain points, because the problem, if we talk for example about regular startups, about the multitude of startups out there, one of the problems is that people, especially when a designer starts making a startup, they start thinking about how to make it beautiful, how to make it convenient. But the fundamental truth is that you can make it ugly, and if it solves the problem, it will be better. So standing out is cool, but for me, that's an extra layer on top.
That's already an extra layer. Yes, I completely understand what you mean. Interesting. Look, so you worked in big tech and you also worked in game dev. So tell us about game dev. You mentioned that game dev is in many ways a very competitive environment, like there's hyper competition there, right? Maybe even more intense than in the regular startup market, though I don't know if it's stronger or not, but that's how it sounds. It almost seems like you shouldn't go into it at all, unless it's with some big, already successful studio, and that you shouldn't try to do your own thing, like start a small indie studio either, because the chances of success aren't very high, but people still want to make games, people go into it. What do you think about that?
Again, you're asking me to give some advice. I can't really single out game dev compared to the rest of the industry. It seems to me that there's hyper competition everywhere now. Just look at the number of startups, the number of big organizations, the number of games. In total, we already have capitalism, and everything is already too much. That is why only the strongest survive. I can't say whether it's worth going into indie development or not. Anyway,
Indie development is definitely alive because even last year it won Game of the Year.
Balakovo. Yes, it is alive because many large gaming companies now have the opposite problem. They are too cautious.
It's like startups.
They're bogged down in all sorts of multi-level approvals and often lose a lot because of it. Let's do it in a way that doesn't offend anyone, so to speak, and they lose that very lively appeal. Why do people play games after all? And there's this trend where people leave game studios, start their own, and their very first game takes off because they've built up all these ideas they weren't allowed to release, so they left and made something really cool.
Yes, but to add a bit of a downer, that still sounds like survivor bias. Yeah, yeah. How many people left Google and created a great startup? And how many left and ended up coming back? Yeah, because it doesn't work. I think it's a very similar situation when you compare Kim Dev and Indie. It's just like comparing those startups. Yes, you can create something, and when you have a strong concept of what you want, in general, for example, I have my own two projects. One is Epicon, the other is Pushkin. One is about push notifications, and the other is about logo search. And overall, I believe that every specialist shouldn't limit themselves to just their main job. They should work on pet projects. Because with pet projects, you gain additional knowledge that you can't get when you're working in too comfortable an environment and so on. You need to try writing code yourself. Create the UI and interface on your own. Basically, do it all solo and so on. Try advertising, learn how to do marketing. And here it seems indie is very similar to that. Even while working in game development, you can work on your own indie game and test your abilities. By doing so, you'll actually be making an impact on your parent company where you work. 5-2, and we're gradually working on the project. Is it worth leaving big companies for indie? I'm not ready to give a recommendation. Everyone has their own path. Yes. I've heard different points of view. Some people say, yeah, I started making an indie game and burned out because of it. I think you also need to approach this as a business after all. Because if you treat your indie game as a business, as a real project that needs to take off, that's one approach. But if you're making an indie game just to fulfill some personal dreams, that's a completely different approach because you can do everything right when making an indie game, and your chances of success will be much higher than if you just make something you personally like. And I think maybe that's the advice here. Guys, if you're making an indie game, it's basically a business project, and you need to think about it that way. You need to think about marketing, about which mechanics work in the market, which ones have a better chance to take off, which ones have less, and so on and so forth. How to allocate your resources and production. Otherwise, you can get exhausted by all of this and burn out.
Yeah, I agree. In general, for example, it's the same as what we talked about with startups like and beauty. First, you need to learn. There's even a step before that. Even before you start solving a problem, you first need to find out if this pain even exists, if this is actually a problem. And here, you need to do some research. I think from the perspective of indie games, it's all the same. Well, you might have a super concept, and what I'm about to say doesn't apply to 100% of game ideas, because sometimes your concepts can be ahead of the current generation's thinking. And in research, it might seem like nobody needs it, but in reality, it could be a breakthrough. But in 90% of cases, before you start developing a game, it's a good idea to research whether it will actually be interesting or not. And think about everything, how you're going to market it, how you're going to distribute it. So here, if you're planning to distribute through Meta, through creatives, it's a good idea to launch some test creatives, see what their cost per install is, how much they cost, whether you have a good click-through rate, and so on. Does it make sense? Because if you're making a game that, for example, is similar to Clash Royale or Hero Wars, the one I work on, then you need to understand that you'll be competing with them specifically on Facebook. So you need to figure out whether you can actually compete with them or not. So before you launch Unity or Unreal Engine and start coding something, you really need to research whether it's worth going in that direction or not, and maybe look for that creative idea first, the one that will actually guide you forward.
Forward.
Or you take a different approach and you think, so I won't go through Creator, I'll go through micro influencers, through influencers. This is also a popular method of spreading the word, but I'll talk about that right at the beginning.
Yeah, after you've already written everything, you start thinking, how do I start selling this now? Well, listen, that's interesting. Let's go through a few questions in order. About X, you mentioned X in game dev, but here's something interesting. It seems like every time, well, this is more about consoles, of course, than mobile development. Every time you open up some games, you think, oh my God, what is this? A million buttons, all this stuff. But then, of course, you get used to it. You start playing gaming. But you, as someone from product, from big tech, what do you think about this? Why is it like that? Why, when you open a game for the first time, does it feel like nothing makes sense at all? Is it just a scary interface?
Well, if we're talking about mobile development, the trend there is changing. But if we're talking about PC development, there are still more of those old school approaches. Those more old school approaches where you enter and the entire interface is dumped on you right away. It's pretty complicated. And sometimes there's so much art that it actually confuses you. Since I switched to mobile development, game development, I can speak for that. And as I watch and analyze the market, I see that if your interface isn't well designed, even the onboarding or the FTUE, first time user experience, when someone sees a creative, downloads the game, opens it, and starts playing, if your UX isn't well thought out at this stage, you're going to have a huge drop off in the funnel because people are lazy too. And when something is difficult for them, they just won't bother with a mobile game. It's simple. Most of these are free to play games, so it's no problem for me to just download another one. On consoles, you usually buy the games, so you're already invested, like you've spent 40 bucks, so you're willing to go through the tutorial. But with mobile games, you just jump in and then you get this tutorial or FTUE where at first there might not be any interface at all, then one button appears, then a second button. Basically, everything is designed to make things as simple as possible, so your brain's cognitive functions don't even get activated or strained, and you just do everything on autopilot, and you just get free dopamine. So at the very beginning, it's important for you to get that free dopamine, essentially, and to figure things out in the game through these simple actions. That's why UX in mobile games has really advanced a lot. You can also see it on PC and consoles. For example, I like playing Fortnite. Everything seems to be good there. So I think things are getting better everywhere. These processes are happening everywhere. Everyone is starting to realize that UX is really important. and people are actually starting to learn. Also, I know additionally that the people I work with in game dev were also taking courses at the same time, improving their qualifications to learn how to work with UX properly. So basically, I joined Nexters a year ago now, and I'm also sharing my expertise on how, what, and where to build.
So we still hope that gradually all of this will be fixed.
It's already getting better.
It's already getting better. Super, super, super. Tell us about your experience about multidisciplinarity. How do you think, in which of these industries, in which of these fields where you've worked, big tech, startups, or game development, where does a designer really need to be more multidisciplinary? And where can you just dig into your own little area and be happy with that?
I don't know, I feel like nowhere. But again, there are two camps. Some people believe in dividing people by narrow specializations. I'm from the other camp. I believe that designers and actually other professionals too should be multidisciplinary. When I worked in product, my opinion was that a product designer is not just a product designer who creates interfaces. Product designer is half a product manager. And they should be able to think about the business the way a product manager does. They could just be responsible for UX, given a problem, they think about it from a UX perspective and so on. But they also need to think like a product manager, what business metrics are involved, how experiments are actually launched, even understand how metrics are analyzed. And thanks to this, we developed a large generation of really talented specialists in search who went on to become art directors everywhere. And in game development, well, I think it's the same because game dev has its own differences. There are UX designers, UI artists, just artists in general, game designers, and people who are more like product managers, but with a strong focus on UX. I'm in favor of designers in game development also being multidisciplinary, and for UX UI designers to think like game designers and product owners. Why are they doing this? What is the purpose behind it? So that artists understand when they create new skins, they need to understand that the company is selling these skins. And the KPI shouldn't be to just make 3 skins, but for example, to make one skin that sells really well. And when people start thinking beyond just their own area, thinking a bit broader, I think the whole company benefits.
Got it? That's interesting. And I think that's good. You know, this kind of approach really aligns with what's happening in the market right now from the perspective of implementing tools, because the narrower your focus, on the one hand, the easier it is to replace you. And the more I think you become just a cog in some hard skills. You might have dug really deep and learned to do something very well and in depth, yes, but now AI is coming in. And now,
AI, of course.
yes, and the fact that it's already taking over some, not entire professions, but certain parts of the process quite significantly. Tell us, what's happening with AI in game development right now? What are you doing with it in your company?
Well, if we're talking about Next Earth, about Hero Wars, then of course we're not standing aside. We're testing and trying to integrate AI wherever it's useful. We try to do it efficiently. So it's not like it's just some side project with only one person in the company working on it. No, actually, overall, we're trying to build a philosophy of not being conservatives because at the beginning, when AI first appeared, well, when LNK appeared, it was like a city of conservative people who simply refused to interact with AI, thinking it would steal something or whatever. Well,
some people told me I didn't spend 10 years studying just to turn this on now, so that something will be generated because of me.
Generated. Yes, I think if that was actually a year ago, in a year, he might have changed.
This person has already changed his world.
I remember how Procreate, I don't know if they've changed this policy or not, the iPad app, when for drawing on the iPad, they took a stand against AI. They banned all AI plugins.
There was something like that. I don't really remember now.
Maybe they still have that policy. You can't just change your stance that quickly. But overall, we're trying to move towards making sure people aren't conservative and to highlight the kind of benefits that can come if we integrate this effectively. For example, I wouldn't say we've started a project, but we have, if I'm not mistaken, the game Hero Wars has 9 voiceovers. Oh, I mean, localizations in 9 languages of the world. And actually, as a team, we spend quite a lot of money on translations. On
localization?
Yes. So at the same time, we have 9 languages. And it seems that if we set up the processes well, we could save some money here, and in some cases, actually expand the number of languages we support. What I'm getting at is, when we talk about AI and design at RTA, we immediately start talking about how it might throw everyone out into the cold at some point in the future. So here, we're more focused on thinking about how to make it deliver more results, more impact, rather than just slightly replacing some work. And that's specifically from the perspective of translations. For example, from the perspective of artists in several areas of work, we've already achieved good results, improving things by about 30 to 40% in some cases, not in all of them. For instance, AI still isn't good enough in every aspect for us to be able to use it. In Herwar, 500,000 people play every day, and we can't just produce low quality stuff simply because it's AI generated. No, we maintain our quality standards and only use it where it makes sense to do so. Where it doesn't, we leave it alone because we already have very talented artists and designers. And for example, what can I share? Sometimes our artists create some really impressive art pieces like wallpapers and so on. And AI is actually quite helpful in solving the blank page problem. The artist first draws a sketch themselves, feeds it into one of the models, it generates the initial layer, and then continues generating from there. Various changes are made using in-painting, different poses, emotions, and in the end, it brings the work up to the quality we need. So it turns into a collaborative process where the artist acts both as an LLM operator and as an artist, kind of like a book editor. There's the writer, and then there's the editor. And the artist helps shape the work, assists the LLM, and the LLM helps the artist. So together they get the job done, and sometimes it's twice as fast as they used to do it before. And that's awesome because, for example, we create a new trailer for the game every season. And before it used to take us longer, but then with various plugins, some AI based, some not, we optimized the process and now we do it 1.5 times faster than we used to. And here it's important to think about this. These are great use cases, where to apply and use them.
Well, that's you talking from a business perspective right now. From the perspective of an ordinary person, say a specialist, it still seems like it's become harder to enter the profession because, well, there's less need for juniors and such. Yeah. And there's still this potential risk that you might get laid off, like your job could be replaced. To reduce the number of people, for example, using layoffs, or maybe even a complete layoff will do it. And here I think this is exactly where the importance of being multidisciplinary comes in. When you're multidisciplinary, you see opportunities, not just that you know how to do something, but for example, you understand what you might need to invest your time in right now, how to adapt, and what else you need to do. And if you're focused on just one thing, of course, it's harder to maneuver.
Well, I agree with you. The only thing is regarding multidisciplinarity, I don't think that's exactly about Genos either.
Well, by the way, how would you put it? Look, all those stories about indie developers when someone, maybe they've never even been in the game industry, but they start coding on their own, doing everything themselves, art, writing, music. So basically, yes, they're a multidisciplinary person, even though they're technically a junior, but they're just not afraid to try doing different things all at once themselves.
No, well, in that sense, it's actually cool. First of all, I also remember that when I got into Search, I was coding myself. I remember being really proud when my code made it into production, right in Search. I even showed my mom. That helped. And at the same time, I knew how to do it. I used to make websites in Bitness when I was freelancing. As a designer, I would code the websites myself. When I joined Yandex, I started coding. And here, it's a really cool skill. When you're still, you could say, a junior in some specialty, but you already have a broad perspective, you understand better how all the systems, all the little parts work together. Because I've seen it many times across all industries when a designer focuses solely on their own area and doesn't understand how their design is actually implemented, how, for example, Unity developers interact with it, how they lay out the designer's mockups, then that designer automatically loses out to someone who does understand how it all works. Because that person has a greater knowledge base, they can optimize certain things in advance, things that will actually be doable and can be done faster. And well, yes, I'll take my words back. Juniors can be disciplined, yes. And as Impra says, we don't, at least in art and design in my departments, we don't really hire juniors right now. So I can't say for sure, but I don't think it will become much harder for them than it is now. At the same time, I think that if you're a junior and you have skills, on one hand, you're developing in a multidisciplinary way, and on the other, you're open to everything new. And thanks to that, you can do things that take others twice as long. For example, you can make a showcase for a presentation or an interview, again, thanks to, say, some AI like Higgs Weld AI. If you make a cool show reel of what you've done, you'll actually get more benefit and have a higher chance of getting in. And the company won't be afraid to hire you. And as you correctly pointed out, if you're already multidisciplinary and you're inside the company, then you're already worth more than any AI, more than a narrow specialist, more than just AI. Because if they try to replace you with AI, sure, it will do part of your job. But in other areas, you were the expert and you were the one who synchronized everything. No, it won't do that. You can't be replaced. More likely, you'll become an art director for various agents who are supposed to work under your guidance.
That actually sounds pretty cool, by the way.
You know, I was also thinking, we were talking about something similar yesterday. I was thinking about, I don't know, the regular watch market wristwatches. And in the past, they were all made by hand. Then Casio came along. I don't remember the history of watches. Which ones were the first
Mass production?
mass production?
But the Japanese did all that. And I remember there was a time when almost 50% of Swiss brands closed down completely because they couldn't compete in terms of accuracy, and
The market just changed.
the market changed. And
Overall, this happens very often. Cars appeared, the market changed, the internet appeared, all the goods disappeared, all the people who used to sell in offline stores at markets were like, well, what do we do now? Now we somehow have to sell through Wildberries. And here I think it's the same thing. A human is a being that, by its very nature, knows how to adapt. And everyone just needs to accept that the world is changing and adapt, to look one step ahead and think, where can I fit into this new world and how can I work there? Because, well, it seems like a lot of changes have happened in all industries over the past 100 years. But it seems like we're all still living in.
especially, yeah, it seems so. It's not like anyone is really dying out completely. On the contrary, I think the number of people living worse off is actually gradually decreasing. Well, yeah, that's true. Actually, if you look at it overall, judging by the demographics, there will still be enough work for everyone because there are fewer people, but it seems like the work isn't stopping. Could you tell us a bit more about the role a design director plays in the game industry? And maybe before you, there wasn't even such a role. Maybe you're actually bringing something new. You mentioned briefly that you're introducing new approaches, restructuring things a bit. Could you please tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I can't really say. I don't really know how many design directors there are in the industry in game dev and what exactly their role is. So let me just talk about my own main role and responsibilities. Well, a few of my tasks. The first is to create and, together with the rest of the management team, help promote the vision of where we're heading. And the vision in terms of both visuals and the prototyping approach, how we're going to achieve that result. And for example, I really do have a lot of UX expertise, so a lot of things end up on my plate, and I get tasked with figuring out how to improve, say, pre-production. I've mentioned it a few times already, and that's one of my roles. So right now, it's about being an ambassador for both UX and vision. That's probably my second function. I have pretty well developed empathy, and overall, I have a good sense for business. I understand the audience quite well. Well, that's just how it turned out. It's not a super skill, it's just that usually what I think should sell often does, though not always, but it works. And here, my role is also to make sure that our interfaces and art, so to speak, actually sell. How do we make sure that our skins and new heroes are designed in a way that makes people want to buy them, so that they're truly satisfied with their purchase, which is very important, and that the purchase evokes the right emotions? And third, I currently oversee several departments. I don't remember if I listed them already. Narrative and scripts, sound design, video design, art with all the 2D and 3D artists, spine animation, VFX animation, UX UI design, and UX research. That's what UX research was for me in Hero Wars. Now it's a really awesome department. And so my task is how to bring all these people together, each of them amazing in their own specialties, how to find synergy between them, how to optimize things so that we start making a much higher quality and more efficient product, and at the same time, make it resonate even more emotionally with players. How do we reduce the divide between, say, game designers and artists so that how to make it so that every member of my department thinks about how they can use their awesome skills to help the game, the players, the business, to help everyone grow and get more positive emotions. So overall, on one hand, it's about vision. On the other, it's about streamlining product processes. And third, it's about working on synergy between teams so they feel multidisciplinary.
Okay. But I also understand that, among other things, you're the one who's actually bringing in innovations, gradually restructuring things, improving them, right? So you're avoiding those pitfalls and you're bringing in your experience, trying to, at least. Okay, so tell me, do you think a big design boss needs to be able to do hands-on work and keep doing it, or is that no longer important and it's more about synergy and everything else?
Should I speak for myself or in general?
Listen, I think you should speak for yourself, but also in general too. What's stopping you from saying it?
For everyone?
Of course. It's just your point of view. I
Can do hands-on work on the one hand, and even more so when it comes to UX. But in the end, my opinion is that for a big boss, if you have a lot of subordinates, then it's more important for you to be able to set the direction, to show where to go, and to make sure everyone works efficiently. So in this case, you really are a manager, and in part, probably also an art director, because you're also conveying the visual vision. And honestly, we have super talented art directors, but I work with them and I completely trust them with how they handle the visuals. But my job is to set the direction, to show, for example, references where we're heading, why we're heading there, and why it's worth going that way, and to calibrate between us and convey the vision to them, which they will then bring to life. And in this regard, it's not like I do a lot of hands-on work now, like creating layouts in Figma, but in reality, I still spend time in Figma every day. And I usually do it like this. I see that work is being done on some layout. I take it and copy it for myself. I rearrange blocks, for example, add a sticker somewhere, draw something with a pencil somewhere else. In other words, I cobble things together from scratch and convey the vision again. My goal isn't to make a perfect layout because then I'd spend too much time on it. I can spend that time on something else. It doesn't matter whether I show it with my own hands or in some other way. The point is to indicate the direction everyone needs to go and they follow it perfectly.
I also meant that the design profession is in many ways applied, yes, and even if you're a big boss, you still need to understand how things work
Of course, absolutely.
so that you're not just throwing out abstract comments. I think you pay attention to this too and you try to understand certain things.
Well, of course, especially if you're a lead, then as a lead, you really need to be a top-notch, highly skilled specialist in this field, because I can't really imagine a lead, say, a narrative producer, someone who writes texts, who doesn't understand the principles of how a story is constructed, what the hero's journey is, and so on. So for leads, yes. But from my perspective, even though I do have some narrative experience, I have some understanding of archetypes, of how a story is built. I've read a few books, but I'm not a professional in this area. But I do understand what we need, why we need it, and I can provide the right arguments for it. Like, we want to get here, and here's why. And I only answer to myself whether this matches or not, whether it's worth testing, or whether it should be redone. Here, this is exactly what we discussed with the leads, and I think it's important for any manager to have the skill. It's a very important and actually very difficult skill, the ability to delegate and to trust in the competence of my employees, because they're the ones doing the work. And at some point, I also need to realize, okay, that's it. I trust this person. We go with these options. That's enough. If I keep nitpicking and reviewing endlessly, the person will burn out.
Yeah. So here's a question. How can a designer actually learn or perhaps begin to understand how to be, as you say, a manager? How can they learn to delegate, to try to grow beyond their usual tasks? Because designers also fall into this trap, where they want to control the final result perfectly so that everything is exactly pixel perfect. And many people see this as their main role, let's say, as the guardian of the final result. You've already gone through this journey. So tell us, share how you grew, how you moved up from designer higher and higher, and eventually became a design director.
You mentioned something really interesting and insightful about how some designers in particular like to take on a kind of protective role in their work. That really matches my experience because I grew up differently. Because it's important, at least I think so. No, I'm sure of it. It's important not to build fences where you put your own expertise above everything else and just keep telling everyone, no, 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 you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. It's always cooler. And the people who grow are the ones who don't think about how to say no, but about how to say yes. They dig into what it is you really want. For example, when a client comes to me, I ask, what do you want? You understand their real problem, the one they actually want to solve. And as a designer, you come up with a way to solve it, maybe even better than what they suggested. And you know how to communicate that to them. And that's why for growth, it's really important not to be uh, uh, the kind of person who constantly says no, guards their territory, and insists, I have great expertise in design, you can't do it this way. Instead, you should be the one who, if you do say no, explains why and offers an alternative solution that's even better. This way, people start to trust you more because you become their colleague, not just someone with an inflated ego. Secondly, and actually probably the most important thing I used to teach all designers is to ask the question, why? Well, I taught this to designers because often when people are doing something, they don't ask themselves why. They got a task in Jira, completed it, great, the task is closed, but they didn't actually solve it because someone, not just them, but say the product manager, also didn't fully think about why. As a result, you get a poor outcome. And I would think, why? I even had an exercise for my designers. When I saw that they struggled with this, that they didn't really understand what they were doing, I made them write their initial comment under the task, describing how they understood the assignment. And often it turned out that their understanding didn't match the actual task. And thanks to the fact that they started writing, they would then calibrate themselves and realize, oh, that's why we're doing this task. And it's important to understand that you need to know why you're doing something, because only then can you do it better and as a result grow. And third, this is more about me personally. Don't be afraid to take responsibility. In fact, I grew because every time I grew because people would say to me, Seryoga, look, there's something over here that doesn't smell too good. Do you want to take this on yourself?
It needs to be sorted out.
Yes. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. And I dealt with it. That's why, so to speak, my grade book was filled with good marks. People trusted me more and I grew because you grow when you can be trusted with more responsibility. If you don't show that you can take on more responsibility, well, then why would you need it?
I think this is a really important point. I've mentioned trust, right? That you need to be trusted, and that's when you actually get the space to grow. But the protective function doesn't really align with trust because trust is, first and foremost, about a person who can figure things out on their own, navigate independently, build additional connections, and establish communication. They just, sit there and guard the mock-up, so to speak.
At the same time, you can't go to the other extreme either. I'm not saying that there should never be the opposite, that a designer shouldn't have their own opinion. And they're just like, okay, that didn't work.
All right, okay.
I'll redo it. So people like that will definitely be slowed down by AI. Yeah, exactly. Because they're not thinking about how to solve the problem. They're just a pair of hands in that moment. That's why they should focus not on how to forbid something, not on how to agree, but on the task itself and how to do it in the best possible way. And that's when you'll get a kind of compromise, actually the best solution, one that works for all sides.
Okay, let me say something a bit provocative. Look, let's take 100% of people, and out of 100%, well, it doesn't matter. Like with entrepreneurs, there's 6%, maybe 10% of the population who are willing to be entrepreneurs. What you're talking about is very similar to entrepreneurship. That is, Taking responsibility, establishing communication, asking yourself questions like, what am I actually doing right now? Why does anyone even need this? And so on. And there's only a certain limited percentage of them, and usually that number doesn't increase. In other words, their number doesn't grow. There are always certain proportions of people: those who come up with ideas, those who are good at implementing them, and those who just do something. And as for those who just do something, how many percent are there? Probably 50. Maybe I'm even underestimating it. Maybe it's even more. So, can we say that all these 50% will be replaced by AI and they'll be left out in the cold? Because what you're talking about, those kinds of things, not everyone can do them. I think it's mostly due to psychological factors, fear, a sense of responsibility, fear of taking on extra workload, and so on.
Regarding the initial question, I don't think that way now. Well, about the 50%. Why? Because I actually wanted to change my mind a bit. Since I'm mostly judging by myself and talking about growth, about my own career path, I'm referring to people who want to grow, specifically those who want to become leaders, managers, and so on. In fact, much of what I say applies to everyone, but still, I'm talking about my own path. But at the same time, in all companies, including product companies, Nexters, Hero Wars, and game development in general, there are people who are individual contributors, experts in their field. They don't want to grow into managers, they don't want to lead people, but they have an incredible passion, for example, for 2D art. And there are such people, and it's really great if you have them because they develop expertise in their domain and help spread it to others. That is, they might not even be managers, but simply serve as experts. We even have a specific role called expert. And for them, well, this approach still applies to them as well. Don't say no, because they too might keep something outside our palette or say not in our style. Being able to figure things out is also a skill that will help them grow here so that everyone around is also considered an expert. But for example, maybe they do need to take less responsibility from another domain because they shouldn't be forced into that. Why would I need something from another domain? I don't want to. I'm hardly connected to Unity at all. Figuring out how, I don't know, art works with Unity, although some of us do figure it out. Maybe someone else doesn't need to. So there's no need to get involved in that, no need to force it. That's why there are ICs, meaning individual contributors, for whom growth, the basic recommendations are the same, but they are still a bit different because I'm primarily talking about managers.
Okay. What do you think? Where is the game development industry heading right now? I mean, what will happen after some time? Will all the big companies divide everything up, take over, and there won't be any new games? Well, because in the mobile sector, for example, the main obstacle right now is marketing. In other words, everything is sold through marketing. It's actually quite rare for something super cool to take off and spread on its own. So it turns out that for your project to be truly successful, you really need to do marketing right, either with money or through some other types of agreements and so on. Doesn't this kind of control over channels or financial control or even price control mean that new projects will quietly die off somewhere and only the big global players, the rich guys, will remain?
No, I think indie projects will remain and will enjoy their own popularity. Some of them, as before, will achieve incredible fame and recognition, and so on. But it seems to me that not much will really change compared to the current situation. Right now, there is also a huge industry, there is indie development, and at the same time, you have various delay games and so on, but Game of the Year is won by an indie developer. There will also appear, well, there probably already are, and there will be various platforms that specifically distribute indie developers. We're familiar with, for example, Nipa Game Dev and Product Hunt, which do the same thing for startups competing with big tech companies. I think the situation here is exactly the same. Yes, 80 to 90 to 95% of the market will belong to the big corporations. By the way, I don't actually know what their share is right now, but 5% will go to indie developers. I believe in them. Again, because every game designer, every product owner is a potential entrepreneur who wants to create their own game. They have a concept of the perfect game and they need to let it out. That's why indie development will definitely never die. I think it will be just as successful as it is now. I think it will become even bigger than that. I think it will become even more successful. Because indie developers have flexibility and courage, a margin for error, the fear of making mistakes is less because they're not corporations. They don't have to report to investors. That's why they can try themselves in different areas. And as we said, thanks to AI, they can be more multidisciplinary. For example, just recently there was this demo showing how worlds are already being auto-generated with AI. Right now, I don't remember exactly, but the head said they can do it for 10 seconds or a few minutes, but it's already happening. So now one person can vibe code.
And create a full-fledged game?
Yes, and then do it according to their own vision. So I actually think, on the contrary, no. I would even say that indie development is about to have its golden age.
A golden age. And if you draw an analogy with startups, I think indie developers should also keep in mind that even if your game doesn't succeed, it could be a stepping stone to something else. Maybe you'll get noticed and get invited to join some company. Or maybe you'll gain extra experience to make your next game even better. Just like how it works with startups, right? Or maybe you'll get acquired, I don't know, or something else will happen. Why not?
Well, definitely, without a doubt. A failed and disappointing game launch, one that did not meet expectations, can't possibly be a negative factor. It's always only positive. The only negative thing is that if you foolishly mortgaged your apartment, you bought advertising with it. Don't do things like that.
No need to do it. Not
That's how it should be done, yes. Especially when you're making your first game. Try to use various free channels like influencers and so on, Reddit and the like. But in any case, the most important thing for me, whether it's pet projects or indie development, is the experience a person gains. And this experience can already be extrapolated when moving on, for example, to an offer from a big company. When I was hiring different people, if I found out that they had a pet project, for me it was an extra plus because I understood that the person had already gained experience there and they have the desire to grow and explore various multidisciplinary areas, as we say, around themselves. And now it's going to be even easier. So even, well, as they say, who said that? That I didn't have 10,000 mistakes, but 10,000 steps on the way to my best project.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. I don't remember who said it, but it's a great story, by the way. Yes, because the fear of making mistakes really holds a lot of people back, and I think it's for nothing. Because even with a pet project, I know that some people don't start working on a pet project because they're afraid that something might not work out and so on and so forth. Okay, look, that's interesting, really interesting. You have this kind of experience and transition, but who do you consider yourself to be more now? Are you in the game industry or are you a product person who's trying to change the game industry?
That's a nice headline. Maybe I am a product person who wants to change things specifically.
Let's call the podcast that then.
Over the past year, I've really immersed myself deeply in game development. So now I consider myself part of the gaming industry. And it's very interesting to me, especially because I've spent a whole year studying our players' behavior, our competitors' behavior, and so on. We conduct competitor research, specifically play tests and so forth, to understand who has which different mechanics. I've already picked up quite a lot, and game development is really close to me. And honestly, I even wonder if should I ever leave game development, I might experience an emotional drop, because here you work directly with emotions, with the community, which is very important. We have 1 million subscribers on YouTube, and people actively discuss the game every day.
Do you read? Do you watch?
I read. I often watch live streams on YouTube. I regularly read updates and messages on Telegram. And I also spend time reading posts and comments on Facebook. And that's, well, an important part that I really like about game development. And I'm incredibly happy that I got an offer from Nexters because I had the chance to get involved before. And now I'm a game dev person. But I can't deny that I'm a game dev person who comes with product experience and came here to make a revolution. Of course.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a good way to wrap up the conversation. Thank you so much for finding the time to come and share your experience. Thanks, by the way, for also giving a talk yesterday. It was a great presentation because I saw how people were listening with interest and enjoying it. In general, it's really great that you shared, that you're so open. It's very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It was awesome. And as I told you, this is my first video podcast.
Well, everything was great. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.